I didn't expect a road trip invitation to come from my uncle's friend, least of all at a time when my life felt paused between what it had been and what it was supposed to become. My name is Evan Carter, and at 26, I had grown used to drifting, between jobs, between apartments, between versions of myself I never fully committed to. When my uncle Robert called and casually mentioned that his old friend Daniel Brooks was driving cross-state for work and could use company, I said yes before I gave myself time to overthink it. Daniel Brooks was not a stranger, but he wasn't family either. I'd seen him at holidays, barbecues, the occasional birthday dinner. He was the kind of man people described as steady. Early 40s, salt and pepper hair, calm voice, the sort of presence that filled a room without demanding attention. He always remembered details, where I'd gone to school, what music I liked, the fact that I took my coffee black. I'd never considered what those small acts of noticing might mean until I found myself packing an overnight bag for a trip that would stretch across several states. That we met early in the morning, the sky still pale and undecided. Daniel's car was clean but lived in, smelling faintly of coffee and something woody I couldn't place. He greeted me with an easy smile and a handshake that lingered half a second longer than necessary, though I told myself I imagined that. As we pulled onto the highway, the city thinning behind us, conversation came easily, safe topics at first. Work. Traffic. How Robert still refused to replace his ancient grill. Daniel drove with the confidence of someone who trusted the road. I watched his hands on the steering wheel, the way he checked the mirrors, the subtle tension in his jaw when he concentrated. He asked about my life with genuine interest, not the polite curiosity people use to fill silence. I told him the truth, or at least a version of it, that I was between jobs, that I wasn't sure what I wanted next. I didn't tell him about the restlessness, or the quiet loneliness that followed me even in crowded rooms. That he listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, as if storing my words somewhere important. When I finished, he didn't rush to offer advice. It's not a failure to be unsure, he said instead. Most people just pretend they aren't. The comment stayed with me longer than it should have. Hours passed marked by mile signs and shifting light. We stopped at a roadside diner with cracked vinyl seats and menus that hadn't changed in decades. Over coffee, Daniel mentioned his life back home. He spoke of routine, workdays that blurred together, evenings spent in familiar silence. He didn't complain, but there was an absence in his tone, as if something essential had been edited out. He mentioned a partner, Michael, briefly and without detail, like a fact that no longer required elaboration. Back in the car, music filled the space where conversation paused. Our tastes overlapped more than I expected. When a song I loved came on, Daniel turned it up without comment. I felt seen in a way that unsettled me. The road stretched long and straight, inviting thoughts I usually kept carefully contained. I was aware of Daniel beside me, of the warmth of the car, of the strange intimacy that develops when two people share a destination but not a history. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape shifted from urban sprawl to open fields. Daniel spoke about his younger years, about choices made quickly and commitments honored out of obligation as much as love. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet honesty. I found myself wanting to ask questions that crossed invisible lines, wanting to understand the spaces between his words. Instead, I asked about the places we passed, the names of towns, the stories behind them. We checked into a small motel just before dusk, the kind with doors that opened directly to the parking lot. 2 separate rooms, a practical arrangement that made sense. Still, as we stood outside with our bags, the air thick with summer heat, I felt a flicker of something I didn't name. Daniel suggested dinner at a place nearby, and I agreed too quickly. Over dinner, the conversation deepened, not by design but by momentum. Daniel admitted he rarely traveled with company anymore. It's easier to be alone, he said, then paused. But not always better. I laughed softly, unsure how to respond, and he smiled as if he understood more than I'd said. Back at the motel, the night settled into quiet. We stood outside our rooms, talking about nothing and everything, the hum of traffic distant and constant. At one point, our silence stretched, comfortable but charged. Daniel looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, thoughtful, maybe conflicted. I felt an urge to fill the space, to say something that would anchor us back to safety, but the words didn't come. "Get some rest," he said finally, his voice gentle. "We've got a long drive tomorrow." I nodded, disappointed by my own relief. As I closed my door, I leaned against it, heart beating faster than the moment warranted. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized the trip had already shifted something inside me. I told myself it was just the road, just the novelty of new company. Yet beneath that rational surface, there was a growing awareness, a sense that I had stepped onto a path where intentions mattered less than proximity. Tomorrow promised more miles, more conversations, and more opportunities to ignore the questions forming quietly in my mind. Morning arrived wrapped in mist. The lake looked silver and still, a mirror without reflection. I woke to the faint creak of boards downstairs and the smell of coffee drifting through the hall. For a moment, I didn't move. The events of the night before, Mark's lingering gaze, the quiet tension, hung like fog in my mind. When I finally went down, my father was outside with Tom, both already dressed for chores. David sat at the counter, newspaper spread before him, his bare feet tapping softly on the floor. Mark stood near the window, stirring sugar into his mug. He turned as I entered, that same steady calm behind his eyes. "Morning, Ethan," he said. "Sleep well?" "Mostly." "Good." He smiled faintly, like the word carried more weight than it should. The day unfolded in slow fragments. My father and Tom repaired a loose section of dock, their laughter echoing over the water. David cleaned fishing rods, humming tunelessly. Mark joined me near the boathouse, where we sorted through tangled ropes and rusted hooks. The air smelled of lakeweed and sun-warmed pine. "You used to come here often?" I asked that he nodded. "Every summer, for a while." "Your dad, me, David, Tom. We thought the world began and ended at this lake." I looked at him. "And now?" "Now the world feels smaller." He smiled without looking up. "But memories make good company when the noise dies down." Something about the way he said it stayed with me, the hint of weariness behind the ease. His eyes were soft, but there was a gravity there, like he was speaking from a place far older than his years. By noon, the sun broke through, scattering gold across the water. We took the boat out, my father steering, Tom telling stories, David lounging with his feet over the edge. Mark sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed when the boat tilted. Each touch, however small, seemed to last a beat too long. That my father didn't notice, or pretended not to. He talked about old times, names I didn't know, jokes that belonged to another generation. I laughed when expected, but the laughter didn't belong to me. At one point, Mark leaned closer and said quietly, "He doesn't see you clearly, does he?" I turned toward him, startled. "What do you mean?" "He looks at you and still sees a boy. But you've grown in ways he doesn't understand." I didn't answer. The air between us tightened, wordless but full. Later, when we returned, my father disappeared into the shed with Tom, leaving David to light the evening fire. Mark lingered near the porch, polishing a glass absently. "You don't talk much," he said after a while. "I guess I learned from my dad." He chuckled softly. "Maybe. But sometimes silence says more than words." The comment struck deeper than I expected. There was no flirtation in his tone, no teasing, just quiet observation. It made me feel seen in a way that was almost uncomfortable. When dinner came, conversation flowed like warm current, drinks poured, plates passed, laughter rebounding through the room. My father grew louder with every glass, the way men do when they mistake volume for control. Mark, in contrast, spoke sparingly. Each word deliberate, each glance precise. I found myself watching him, the curve of his hand around the glass, the way his voice softened when he addressed me. At one point, David leaned across the table and said, "You look just like your father did at your age, Ethan. Maybe a little less trouble, though." "Don't bet on it," Tom added, earning another round of laughter, but Mark's gaze didn't join the humor. He looked at me for a long moment, then down at his drink. The noise around us faded, and for a breath, it felt like there were only two people in that room. When the plates cleared, the others drifted toward the fire pit outside. The night was thick with the smell of rain, clouds rolling in over the lake. My father sat with Tom and David, trading stories too loud for the calm that surrounded them. Mark stayed behind, collecting bottles, his movements unhurried. "Storm's coming," he said. "I know." He nodded toward the window. "You can feel it in the air before it arrives, like everything's holding its breath." I stood beside him, close enough to hear the low rhythm of his breathing. The rain began as a whisper on the roof, then gathered strength, rattling against the glass. Lightning flared across the lake, white and brief. The power flickered once and died. The room fell into darkness, broken only by the faint glow from the fireplace outside. "Guess we're on candle duty," Mark said quietly. He found a box on the shelf, lit a single wick. The small flame painted his face in shifting gold, the light softening the sharpness of his features. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty, it pulsed with something fragile, unspoken. "Finally," he said, "you remind me of myself at your age." I glanced up. "That's supposed to be a compliment?" He smiled faintly. "Depends who's asking." I laughed, though it came out shaky. He turned to the window again, rain streaking down the glass like veins. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who never really see us," he said. "And sometimes the ones who do, aren't supposed to." The words lingered, low and dangerous. Before I could respond, the screen door opened and David's voice called out, "Mark, you hiding from the storm?" He turned away, the moment breaking cleanly, like glass underfoot. "Just waiting for it to pass," he answered. David grinned, stepping inside with a towel draped over his shoulders. "Good luck with that. It's going all night." They spoke easily, old friends resettling into rhythm. I stood back, caught between presence and retreat, unsure which direction to choose. When the lightning flashed again, Mark's eyes met mine across the dim room. There was no smile this time, just an acknowledgement, quiet and deliberate. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake. Inside, laughter rose again, masking what had almost been said. Hours later, after the others had drifted to bed, I found myself awake in the dark. The rain still pressed against the roof, soft and steady. Somewhere below, footsteps moved lightly, then stopped. For a moment, I thought of going down, to speak, to ask, to understand, but I stayed where I was, caught between fear and longing. The lake house groaned with the weight of the storm, its walls whispering with wind and memory. I closed my eyes, knowing something irreversible had begun. Though neither of us had crossed any line, something had shifted in the quiet between us. And even through the noise of the storm, I could still hear Mark's voice. Low, patient, dangerous in its truth. "Sometimes the ones who see us, aren't supposed to." The next morning, Ethan woke with the uneasy residue of dreams that wouldn't quite dissolve. Daniel's words echoed in his mind, "Sometimes people only see what they're ready to understand." The sentence clung to him, weaving itself through every thought that day. He tried to paint, but the brush refused to move as freely as it used to. His art, once his escape, now mirrored his confusion. Over the following weeks, Daniel seemed more distant, often canceling plans with vague excuses. Yet when they did speak, he was tender, thoughtful, almost protective. Ethan wanted to believe it was just stress or fear, that love sometimes required patience. But a small, growing voice in his mind whispered otherwise. At home, Robert's behavior had shifted too. Claire mentioned during one of their phone calls that he'd been spending more time working late. She said it lightly, as though it were nothing unusual, but Ethan caught the trace of worry in her tone. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just parental instinct. Still, something about the overlap unsettled him. Daniel's sudden elusiveness, his father's absences, both circling the same unspoken mystery point. One evening, Daniel invited Ethan over to a rented apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't the first time Ethan had been there, but that night, something about the place felt different. A framed photo on the shelf caught his eye, a familiar park bench, the one near his parents' neighborhood. Daniel noticed his gaze. "You like that spot?" Daniel asked, his tone calm but watchful. "I grew up near there," Ethan replied. "It's strange. I've never seen anyone take that exact picture. Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe we've crossed paths before and didn't know it. Ethan laughed softly, but his heart gave a small, uncertain flutter. Maybe. As the night went on, the conversation drifted from art to childhood. Daniel listened intently, his questions gentle but probing. When Ethan mentioned his father, his rigidity, his pride, Daniel's expression shifted for just a moment, as if something unspoken had struck him. He sounds complicated, Daniel said quietly. He is, Ethan replied. But he tries. I just wish he'd see me, really see me. Daniel's eyes softened, though his voice trembled slightly. Sometimes people only understand what they're brave enough to face. The repetition of that phrase chilled Ethan. He tried to mask his reaction, nodding slowly, pretending it was just another coincidence. But the air between them thickened, as though truth hovered just beneath the surface. Later that night, when Daniel stepped into the kitchen to pour wine, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from his mother. Dad's been acting strange lately. He keeps saying he needs time alone. Are you okay? Ethan glanced toward the kitchen doorway. Daniel was humming softly, the low tune oddly familiar. His father used to hum the same melody on Sunday mornings. His chest tightened. It couldn't be. His mind raced to connect fragments that refused to align, the phrasing, the park photo, the tune. They were just coincidences, they had to be, but then, Daniel returned with 2 glasses of wine and said something that stopped Ethan cold. You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who wanted the world to make sense before they could love themselves. It was a phrase his father had once told him when he came out at 18, word for word. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. The glass trembled in his hand. He forced a smile, pretending not to notice, not to understand. The rest of the evening passed in fragmented conversation, his mind caught between disbelief and dawning fear. When Daniel finally left for a meeting, Ethan sat in silence, surrounded by shadows. He couldn't sleep. At midnight, his curiosity overtook his restraint. He picked up Daniel's coat, which he had left draped over the couch, intending to hang it up, but as he lifted it, a wallet slipped from the inside pocket. He hesitated before picking it up. His conscience begged him to stop, to respect privacy. But his instincts screamed otherwise. Inside was a driver's license. The name was what shattered everything, Robert Cole. Ethan's breath caught violently. His body went rigid, a tremor crawling down his spine. He blinked, hoping he'd read it wrong, but the letters stayed fixed, undeniable. The photo showed his father, younger, smiling faintly, and beside it, a folded paper tucked neatly into the wallet's sleeve. Ethan unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a rental agreement. The address was Daniel's apartment. His chest constricted, air refused to come easily. Daniel wasn't just some mysterious stranger. He was his father, not in body, but in disguise, in deceit, in betrayal deeper than Ethan could have imagined. Robert had been living a double life, pretending to be someone else, pretending to understand Ethan by becoming the kind of man Ethan might fall for. The room swayed. Ethan dropped the wallet as if it burned him. Everything, every conversation, every message, turned sickeningly false. The affection, the compassion, the warmth that had felt healing now reeked of manipulation. He stumbled to the bathroom sink and splashed water on his face, trying to steady his breathing. The mirror stared back at him, fractured and foreign. How could his father have done this? Was it a test? A punishment? Or worse, an attempt to feel what Ethan felt, to study his son's love from inside the wound itself? By morning, Ethan couldn't bring himself to speak to anyone. His phone lit up with messages from Daniel. Are you okay? You left something behind, please, don't disappear. He ignored them all. Each word now felt like poison. That evening, he drove to his parents' house without fully deciding why. The drive blurred past him, light smearing across his windshield, heart pounding against his ribs. When he arrived, Claire opened the door, surprised to see him. Robert wasn't home. He said he had another late meeting, she said softly. Ethan forced a nod, his voice barely holding steady. Yeah. I figured. He walked through the living room, taking in every detail, the framed photos, the smell of coffee, the piano in the corner. It all looked exactly the same, and yet none of it felt real anymore. When Robert finally came home near midnight, he froze at the sight of Ethan standing by the window. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was no longer invisible, it was alive, pulsing through the air. "I know," Ethan said finally, his voice shaking. "I know who Daniel is." Robert's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Ethan's eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. "Was this your way of understanding me? Pretending to be someone else? Lying to me just to feel control again?" "Ethan, don't," he said sharply. "You don't get to say my name like that." Silence swallowed the room. Claire stirred upstairs, but didn't come down. The truth, heavy and irreparable, hung between them like a storm neither could escape. Ethan turned toward the door, his voice low but steady. "You wanted to understand me, Dad. Congratulations. Now you know what it feels like to be broken by someone you love." He walked out before Robert could respond. The night air hit him like glass, sharp, cold, unforgiving. As he drove away, the road ahead blurred through the shimmer of tears he could no longer hold back. Behind him, the house stood still in the dark, and inside it, a father finally faced the weight of what understanding truly meant, and for the first time, Ethan didn't look back. The final stretch of the road passed without ceremony. Daniel Brooks drove with the same measured focus he had shown since the morning, his attention anchored firmly ahead, as if the asphalt could offer answers neither of us dared to ask aloud. I watched the landscape shift back into the familiar markers of home, service stations, exits I recognized, the subtle tightening in my chest that signaled the end of something undefined yet significant. When we reached the city, traffic thickened and conversation became unnecessary. Daniel dropped me off outside my apartment just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment longer than required. "I'm glad you came with me," he said quietly. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any apology. I thanked him, my voice steady despite the conflicting emotions underneath. There was no promise to stay in touch, no attempt to soften what we both understood. Daniel nodded once, a gesture of closure, and drove away. I stood on the sidewalk watching until his car disappeared, then turned toward my building with a sense of finality that surprised me. Inside, the silence of my apartment felt sharper than it had before, each familiar object suddenly altered by context. In the days that followed, routine resumed with deceptive ease. I answered emails, ran errands, reconnected with friends. Yet beneath the surface, the trip replayed itself in fragments, glances held too long, words chosen too carefully, the brief moment when possibility had outweighed reason. I resisted the urge to assign blame, understanding that what happened existed in the space between two people carrying their own unmet needs. Uncle Robert called once, casually asking how the trip had gone. I told him it was fine, the truth reduced to something manageable. Daniel's name didn't come up again, and I was grateful for that. It allowed the experience to remain contained, personal, free from explanation. With time, clarity replaced intensity. I recognized the dynamic for what it had been, an intersection of timing and vulnerability, not a foundation for anything lasting. Daniel had been honest about his limits, and I had accepted them even as I hoped for more. The disappointment I felt was not rooted in rejection but in the realization that wanting something does not make it right to pursue. The experience reshaped how I viewed myself. I understood now that being seen, truly seen, carried responsibility as well as comfort. I learned the difference between connection and escape, between intimacy that builds and intimacy that borrows. These distinctions were subtle but essential, and I carried them forward with a new sense of self-respect. Occasionally, I wondered how Daniel had returned to his life, whether the trip had left a mark on him as it had on me. I never reached out, respecting the boundary we had silently agreed upon. Some stories are not meant to be continued, they exist to inform what comes next. On quiet evenings, when the world slowed enough for reflection, I thought about the road and how it had offered both clarity and temptation. The journey had not given me love, but it had given me insight, a reminder that choosing oneself sometimes means walking away from what feels urgent in favor of what endures. As I moved forward, the memory of the trip settled into something less sharp, more instructive. It became a chapter one could revisit without regret, a testament to the importance of honesty, even when it arrives too late. The road had ended, but its lesson remained, guiding me toward a future shaped not by what almost was, but by what I now knew to seek.